March 6, 1944. Verneuchen Air Base, 27 kilometers northeast of Berlin. The morning air bit with winter's last breath as Oberst Werner Mulders, commander of Jagdgeschwader 53, raised his binoculars to scan the western horizon. The sky was a pale blue, perfect for aerial observation. His breath condensed in the frigid air as he waited, tension evident in his rigid posture. Air raid sirens already wailed across Berlin, but that wasn't what concerned him. American bombers had attacked the Reich capital before. It was what accompanied these bombers that now caused his stomach to knot. Herr Oberst, the first reports are coming in. A young lieutenant approached, breathless. The observers confirm there are Mustangs escorting the bombers. Mulders lowered his binoculars slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. Impossible. Berlin is more than 700 kilometers from the English coast. No fighter has the range to reach here and return. The reports are confirmed, sir. They are definitely P-51s, and they are coming in the thousands. The commander raised his binoculars again. Now he could see them, small silver dots reflecting the morning sun, flanking the heavier formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers. Mustangs. Over Berlin, the impossible had become reality. At that moment, the course of the air war changed irrevocably. The capital of the Reich, the heart of Nazi Germany, was no longer beyond the reach of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe had just lost its last sanctuary. The air war over Europe had entered a new and fatal phase for Germany. Since the beginning of daylight bombing operations by the Americans in 1942, the Luftwaffe had relied on one crucial advantage. American heavy bombers, though devastating, could only be escorted by fighters to a certain distance over European territory. To reach targets in Germany, the B-17s and B-24s had to fly hundreds of kilometers without protection. It was in this vulnerable interval that German fighters attacked, causing heavy casualties among the flying fortresses and liberators. The first efforts to provide long-range escort for the bombers used P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, but these aircraft, despite their impressive capabilities, still lacked sufficient range to accompany the bombers to the heart of Germany. Berlin remained out of reach, a fact that the Luftwaffe leadership considered crucial protection. Until that March day, when P-51 Mustangs appeared in the skies over the German capital, forever changing the balance of power in European skies. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe, would later be quoted saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." That phrase perfectly encapsulated the shocking revelation that befell the German High Command that day, the realization that they now faced not just a superior military force, but the full expression of American industrial might that had produced an aircraft capable of defeating the Luftwaffe on its own territory. This is the account of that critical moment in World War II when the arrival of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin heralded the beginning of the end of German air supremacy and paved the way for the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. Planning and expectations. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. March 5, 1944, 23 hours and 30 minutes. Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle leaned over the enormous operations map, his shadow cast by the suspended lamps. Around him, staff officers observed in silence. The plan he was about to authorize was, without exaggeration, revolutionary. "Tomorrow," said Doolittle with his characteristic certainty, "we will prove that no place in the Reich is beyond our reach. 830 bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters, including 258 P-51B Mustangs. The target, Berlin." A murmur swept through the room. Berlin had been bombed before, but never with full fighter escort all the way. The targets would be the Bosch facilities and other electrical equipment factories vital to the German war machine. When Doolittle had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January of that same year, he had made a crucial change in strategy. Under his predecessor, fighters were required to stay close to the bombers for protection. Doolittle released his fighters to attack the Luftwaffe wherever they found it, in the air or on the ground. The new strategy was clear, not just to protect the bombers, but to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. "We expect strong resistance," continued Colonel Curtis LeMay, responsible for the bombing wing. "Berlin is the heart of the Reich. Göring will gather every available fighter to defend the capital." "Exactly what we want," replied Doolittle with a slight smile. "We want them to come up and fight, and when they do, the Mustangs will be waiting." The plan critically depended on the newly arrived P-51B Mustang, equipped with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine manufactured under license by Packard. This combination of American airframe and British engine had created something extraordinary. A fighter that combined speed, maneuverability, and crucially, range, especially when equipped with additional drop tanks. At a nearby base, Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, explained the mission to his pilots. Blakesley was a veteran fighter and fierce advocate for the Mustang. His group had received the first P-51Bs just 1 week earlier, on February the 28th, and they were already about to undertake one of the most ambitious missions of the war. "You will have the honor of being the first American fighter pilots to fly over Berlin," Blakesley told the young aviators gathered. "The Germans don't believe we can do this. They're so confident Berlin is beyond our reach that they keep many of their squadrons based near the capital. Tomorrow, we'll show them how wrong they are." A young pilot raised his hand. "Sir, what's our range with the extra tanks?" "More than 8 hours," Blakesley answered. "More than enough to go there and back with fuel for combat." The pilots exchanged looks of amazement. 8 hours was an eternity for a fighter pilot, more than double the range of the P-47 Thunderbolt that many of them had flown previously. Meanwhile, on the other side of the English Channel, a very different meeting was taking place. At the Reich Aviation Ministry in Berlin, Luftwaffe generals discussed their defense plans, completely unaware of what the Americans were about to unleash. General Adolf Galland, inspector of the Luftwaffe's fighters, had repeatedly warned about the danger posed by the Mustang. His reports, based on initial encounters with the new fighter, highlighted its extraordinary combination of speed and range. But his warnings were largely ignored. "Reports about the Mustang's range are exaggerated," confidently declared General Bruno Leuertzer, one of Göring's close friends. "No fighter can escort bombers to Berlin and return. It's simply impossible." Galland shook his head in frustration. "I've seen what these planes can do. With drop tanks, they have sufficient range." "Nonsense," replied Leuertzer, dismissing the idea. "The Americans will try another attack on Berlin, yes, but their fighters will have to abandon them long before they get here. As always, our pilots will have a feast." The expectations on both sides for the following day could not have been more divergent. The Americans were about to demonstrate a capability that the Germans considered impossible. The Luftwaffe, despite warnings from some of its most perceptive commanders, was unprepared for what was coming. Intelligence and preparations. At the Aerial Intelligence Center in Medmenham, England, teams worked tirelessly, analyzing reconnaissance photographs and agent reports. Allied aerial intelligence had become a well-tuned machine, capable of mapping German air defenses with impressive precision. "We've identified 67 Luftwaffe airfields within a 100-kilometer radius of Berlin," explained Intelligence Officer Captain Richard Johnson, pointing to a detailed map. "We estimate between 350 and 400 fighters available for the immediate defense of the capital." The reconnaissance photographs, captured by modified PR Spitfires flying at more than 33,000 feet, showed the positions of the anti-aircraft batteries that formed a defensive ring around Berlin. Each position had been meticulously mapped and catalogued. A critical innovation for the planned mission was the new 108-gallon drop tank. These were not mere appendages, they were the heart of the range revolution that would make escort to Berlin possible. Each P-51 would carry 2 of these tanks, dramatically increasing its endurance. Lieutenant James Brooks, an engineer from North American Aviation sent to England to oversee the integration of the tanks, explained to the ground crews. These tanks increase the fuel capacity by 216 gallons. That means an additional range of more than 400 miles. They're made of papier-mâché with an internal sealing coating. Lightweight, but effective. A veteran mechanic shook his head, impressed. Papier-mâché? We're going to conquer Berlin with papier-mâché and glue? Exactly, smiled Brooks. War economy at its finest. As the technical preparations advanced, mission planners finalized the routes. The path to Berlin would be dotted with carefully selected navigation points, using prominent land features such as rivers, lakes, and cities. For the pilots, precise navigation would be as crucial as combat skill. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe was also making its preparations, though based on fatally incorrect assumptions. The Germans expected an attack on Berlin. Radio interceptions and spy reports had made that clear. But their defenses were organized based on the assumption that American bombers would be without fighter escort long before reaching the capital. Luftwaffe General Hannes Trautloff, commander of Berlin's air defenses, had ordered his units to concentrate on the bomber formations, not on potential escorts. Focus on the bombers, he instructed his squadron commanders. Any fighters you encounter will be at the limit of their range and cannot stay to fight. This erroneous assessment would be a critical factor in the events of the following day. On the night before the mission, final preparations were made on both sides. At RAF and USAAF bases throughout England, armorers meticulously loaded the 650 caliber machine guns of each Mustang. Each aircraft would receive 400 rounds per gun, enough for approximately 17 seconds of continuous fire. Sergeant William O'Malley, Chief of Armament for the 4th Fighter Group, supervised the work with a critical eye. Remember, boys, tomorrow is not a day for jams. Every belt must be perfect. Later, in his quarters, Lieutenant John Godfrey, a pilot with the 354th Fighter Group, wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we go to Berlin." Berlin! No one believed we would get this far. Some of the boys are nervous, but I only feel a strange calm. This is the ultimate test for the Mustang, and for all of us. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the German air defense system was on high alert. In schools, factories, and government offices, workers once again practiced evacuation procedures to air raid shelters. For Berlin residents, air attacks had become part of the grim routine of war. At the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Reich Aviation Ministry, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled the latest reports. One of them, Major Hans Wilsdorf, a specialist in Allied aircraft capabilities, had noticed disturbing patterns in recent interactions with Mustangs. "Herr General," he said to General Wolfgang Martini, head of Luftwaffe intelligence, "I've been observing reports of P-51s operating increasingly far into Germany. Their capabilities may be greater than we've assumed." Martini looked at him with irritation. "We've already determined that their maximum range, even with drop tanks, is insufficient to reach Berlin. Your calculations are wrong." With all due respect, sir, the Americans have been very inventive with their field modifications. If they've found a way to increase fuel capacity— "Enough," interrupted Martini. "Tomorrow we'll have definitive proof. Now, focus on the bombers' approach routes. Wilsdorf nodded and returned to his work, but doubts persisted. Like many other mid-level Luftwaffe officers, he perceived worrying signs that his superiors chose to ignore. At midnight, preparations on both sides were complete. At air bases around Berlin, Luftwaffe pilots slept restlessly, anticipating another day of intense combat. In England, American crews tried to rest before a mission that would fundamentally alter the course of the air war. Opening actions, 4 o'clock in the morning, March 6, 1944. At 8th Air Force bases scattered across eastern England, the roar of thousands of Wright Cyclone and Pratt & Whitney engines broke the pre-dawn silence. B-17s and B-24s began taxiing to the runways, their navigation lights creating artificial constellations that moved slowly in the darkness. Inside the B-17 Memphis Belle II of the 100th Bomb Group, pilot Captain Robert Morgan adjusted his instruments as the enormous flying fortress vibrated under the power of its 4 engines. "Today's the big day, boys," he spoke into the intercom to his crew of 9 men. "First daylight raid on Berlin with full escort. Say your prayers." The air temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, as the bombers climbed to their assembly altitude of 25,000 feet. Inside the unpressurized aircraft, exposed metal surfaces frosted over despite the heaters struggling to maintain livable conditions. Gunners in their positions blew on their hands, knowing that once combat began, they would have to handle their weapons with bare fingers or lose the dexterity needed to clear jams. 700 miles away, the first radar installations along the Dutch coast detected the approaching armada. The German early warning system, a sophisticated network of Freya and Würzburg radar stations, began tracking the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, the first reports arrived at 5:30 a.m. Large bomber formation assembling over the North Sea. Estimated strength 700 plus. Course east-southeast. The standard alert sequence began. Fighter pilots at air bases throughout northern Germany were awakened and briefed. The routine was familiar. American bombers had been coming for months. What no one yet realized was that this day would be different. At RAF Debden, the base of the 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Blakesley led the first group of P-51Bs into the lightening sky at 5:45 a.m. His 3 squadrons, the 334th, 335th, and 336th, comprised 48 Mustangs, the full combat strength of the group. Unlike the bombers, which assembled in precise formations over England, the fighters took off in small groups and climbed individually to save fuel. They would rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea, timing their arrival to maintain maximum escort efficiency. Captain James Goodson, a veteran pilot with the 4th Group, watched the dawn break as he climbed through 15,000 feet. The Mustang's Merlin engine purred smoothly, so different from the thunderous radial of the P-47 he had flown previously. The cockpit was cold but not unbearable, the heating system actually functioning unlike in many fighters. Below, the North Sea stretched gray and forbidding. Goodson checked his fuel gauges, a ritual he would repeat obsessively throughout the mission. With main tanks, wing tanks, and 2 external drop tanks, he carried 489 gallons, an unprecedented amount for a single-engine fighter. The mission plan called for precise fuel management. Cruise on external tanks until enemy contact, then drop them and switch to internal fuel for combat, saving enough for the long return journey. At 6:30 a.m., the bomber's stream crossed the Dutch coast. Almost immediately, the first German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt Bf-109s from JG-1, rising to meet what they expected to be the escort's outer limit. Instead, they found themselves facing not just P-47s and P-38s, but the first wave of P-51s. Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group described the first engagement. They came at us in the usual way, climbing to attack the bombers from below. They didn't adjust their tactics because they didn't expect us to be there. We had altitude and speed advantage, and they never knew what hit them. The early combat set the pattern. German fighters, expecting to face only bombers beyond a certain point, instead met aggressive American fighters with full fuel tanks and a mandate to engage. The shock was palpable in Luftwaffe radio transmissions, intercepted by Allied monitoring stations. Achtung! Mustangs! Mustangs at 26,000 feet over Hanover. As the bomber stream pushed deeper into Germany, the pre-planned fighter relay came into operation. The P-47s, reaching the limit of their range, turned back, while fresh P-51s moved forward to take their place. This seamless transition, impossible just months earlier, was now the standard American tactic. By 8:30 a.m., Sahiraos Naladriyuan Torrents, as the bomber formation approached Brandenburg, the full strategic implications were becoming clear to German commanders. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, was leading a group of JG-11 when he encountered Mustangs just 60 miles from Berlin. It was the moment we had feared, he later recalled. We were climbing to intercept the bombers when we were jumped by Mustangs. Not just a few strays, but organized squadrons with full fuel. They were hunting in packs, aggressive, confident. That's when I knew a fundamental shift had occurred. What followed was described by participants on both sides as among the most intense aerial combat of the war. Over Brandenburg and the approaches to Berlin, hundreds of fighters engaged in swirling, chaotic dogfights. The Americans, freed from close escort duties by Doolittle's new directive, actively sought combat rather than merely defending the bombers. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. American pilots, many flying their first combat mission to Berlin, found themselves with significant advantages: higher altitude, more ammunition, and, crucially, no fuel concerns. German pilots, taught to expect Allied fighters to withdraw due to fuel limitations, instead faced adversaries who could remain in combat indefinitely. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group recalled, "We had been told for months about conserving fuel, about the limitations of our range. Now, suddenly, we had more fuel than we knew what to do with. It changed everything about how we fought. We could pursue, we could circle, we could re-engage. The psychological impact was enormous." At 9:15 a.m., the first American bombers reached Berlin. The capital of the Third Reich, previously attacked only by unescorted bombers suffering heavy losses, now faced a fundamentally different threat: hundreds of heavy bombers with fighter escort directly overhead. As the first bombs fell on the Bosch works and other industrial targets, the full meaning of the day's events began to register among German leadership. The critical moment, 9:32 a.m., March 6, 1944. Tempelhof Flughafen, Berlin. Oberst Hans-Joachim Jabs stood rigidly on the airfield tarmac, watching as his pilots scrambled to their aircraft. The wail of air raid sirens had been continuous for 45 minutes, and the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire rolled across the city like an approaching storm. As commander of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, a night fighter unit, Jabs and his men rarely flew daylight missions. Today was different. Every available aircraft and pilot had been called into service. His adjutant approached at a run, face pale beneath his flight cap. Herr Oberst, the reports are confirmed. American fighters are over the city. Mustangs. Hundreds of them. Jabs felt ice form in his stomach. You're certain? Not thunderbolts or lightnings. Positive identification, sir. P-51s, clearly marked. They're escorting the bomber formations directly over the center of Berlin. In that moment, standing on the concrete apron as his pilots raced to their Messerschmitt 110 night fighters, aircraft never designed for daylight combat, against nimble single-engine fighters, Jabs experienced what thousands of Luftwaffe personnel would later describe as the moment of revelation. The Americans had achieved what German leadership had repeatedly assured them was impossible: fighter escort all the way to Berlin. This wasn't merely a tactical surprise. It represented a fundamental strategic shift, the moment when the mathematics of industrial warfare became undeniable. If the Americans could put fighters over Berlin today, they could put them anywhere in the Reich tomorrow. The combat over Berlin that day was as fierce as any in the air war. The Luftwaffe committed over 200 fighters to the defense, attacking in waves. American bomber crews, accustomed to fighting alone over German territory, found themselves with unprecedented support. P-51s weaved protective patterns around the bomber boxes, intercepting German fighters before they could press home their attacks. Major Walter Dahl, leading elements of JG-3, attempted to organize a mass attack on the bombers from behind, a tactic that had proven devastating against unescorted formations. His pilots formed up in the company front formation, 8 abreast, preparing to tear through the bomber stream. Before they could execute their attack, they were bounced by Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group. It was as if they knew exactly what we were planning, Dahl later wrote. We were caught completely unprepared, with our aircraft configured for bomber attack, not fighter combat. The result was slaughter. The Mustang's impact went beyond the tactical level. General Adolf Galland, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, received reports throughout the day that painted an increasingly desperate picture. By noon, it was clear that this was not a fluke or a one-time maximum effort mission. The Americans had permanently extended their fighter umbrella to cover the entire Reich. At Reichsmarschall Göring's headquarters at Karenhall, the reports triggered a crisis meeting. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy had been built around the sanctuary of interior lines, the ability to concentrate forces against bomber formations once they passed beyond escort range. That fundamental advantage had evaporated overnight. "How is this possible?" Göring demanded. "You assured me their fighters lacked the range." General Martini, the intelligence chief who had dismissed warnings about the Mustang's capabilities, could only stammer, "The reports must be exaggerated, Herr Reichsmarschall. Perhaps they are confusing aircraft types." A staff officer interrupted, placing reconnaissance photographs on the table. "These were taken 30 minutes ago, sir. They clearly show P-51s over the center of Berlin." Göring stared at the images in silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "When I see Mustangs over Berlin, I know the jig is up." The phrase would be recorded by his adjutant and later become the most famous quote associated with the Mustang's arrival over Berlin, the moment when even the most optimistic German commanders recognized the strategic implications, immediate aftermath and perspective. By late afternoon on March 6th, the bomber formations had turned westward, beginning the long journey back to England. Of the 830 bombers that had set out that morning, 69 would not return, a loss rate of 8.3%. While significant, this was far below the catastrophic losses suffered during unescorted raids in 1943. More importantly, the fighters escorting them had demonstrated that no target in Germany was beyond their reach. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 356th Fighter Group landed at his base in Boxted, England. After 8 hours and 15 minutes in the air, the longest fighter mission yet flown in the European theater. His logbook entry was laconic. Mission to Berlin. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed. 1 probable. Plenty of fuel to spare. In his post-mission report, Johnson expanded on the experience. The Germans seemed genuinely shocked to see us. Their tactics were based entirely on the assumption that we couldn't be there. They kept looking over their shoulders for fuel gauges we didn't have to worry about. For German pilots, the realization was equally stark. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, who would end the war as the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 victories, was based in the East at the time, but heard about the Berlin raid from colleagues. When they told me Mustangs had reached Berlin, he later recalled, I knew immediately what it meant. The sanctuary was gone. They could reach us anywhere. The strategic implications were not lost on Allied leadership either. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote to General Hap Arnold the following day. The P-51 has revolutionized the air war in Europe. Yesterday's mission to Berlin proves that the daylight bombing offensive can now reach any target in Germany with acceptable losses. The Luftwaffe has lost its final advantage. Winston Churchill, upon receiving reports of the mission, remarked to Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, "The Americans have succeeded where we dared not venture." Their long-range fighter has changed the equation fundamentally. For the citizens of Berlin, March 6th, Black Monday, as it would come to be known, marked a psychological turning point. Air raids were nothing new. The Royal Air Force had been bombing Berlin at night since 1940, but the appearance of American fighters overhead shattered the reassurances they had received from Nazi leadership about the impenetrability of Reich airspace. A Berlin schoolteacher wrote in her diary that evening, "Today, we saw American fighters flying over the Tiergarten as casually as if they were over their own country." When I mentioned this to a party official, he turned pale and had no answer. If they can reach Berlin with fighters, what is left of Göring's promises? Strategic consequences. The strategic impact of the Mustang's appearance over Berlin extended far beyond a single raid. In the weeks and months that followed, the entire air war over Europe was transformed. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, had already implemented a fundamental shift in fighter tactics in January 1944, telling his commanders, "Your first priority is not the defense of the bombers, but the destruction of the Luftwaffe." The arrival of the P-51 over Berlin now gave his fighters the reach to pursue this objective anywhere in German airspace. What followed was Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, an all-out offensive against the German aircraft industry. Between February 20th and 25th, American bombers, now with Mustang escort all the way to their targets, attacked aircraft factories throughout Germany. The Luftwaffe was forced to defend these targets, leading to massive air battles that cost them irreplaceable pilots. The mathematics of attrition now worked decisively against Germany. In the first 3 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 pilots, men who could not be replaced at anything approaching the American training rate. By contrast, the USAAF's training program was producing 11,000 new pilots every month. Major Werner Mulders, the Luftwaffe's tactical innovator, had warned years earlier, "The battle will be won by the side that has the last man in the air." The P-51 had ensured that the last man would be American. Beyond pilot losses, the Mustang's range enabled the systematic targeting of Germany's most vulnerable resource, oil. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Perlitz, and Brucks had previously been beyond effective bomber range due to unacceptable loss rates. Now, with Mustang escort, these critical facilities came under sustained attack. The impact was catastrophic for the German war machine. Aviation fuel production fell from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to just 30,000 tons by July, and a mere 10,000 tons by September. German training programs were curtailed, then virtually eliminated. New pilots arrived at combat units with as little as 50 hours total flight time, compared to American pilots with 300 to 400 hours. By June 1944, the transformation was complete. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy, compared to 14,674 Allied sorties. Only 2 German fighters appeared over the invasion beaches, a vivid demonstration of how thoroughly air superiority had been achieved. Adolf Galland, who had warned of the Mustang threat and been ignored, would later write, "The Mustang was the turning point. Once they appeared over Berlin in March 1944, we knew we had lost control of our own airspace. After that, it was simply a matter of time." Epilogue. In the final analysis, the appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, represents one of the most decisive technological and strategic shifts of World War II. The moment when Luftwaffe pilots looked up to see American fighters above the Reich capital marked the end of German air superiority and the beginning of the final phase of the air war in Europe. The significance extended beyond the immediate tactical surprise. It demonstrated the fundamental power of American industrial capacity, the ability to not just design an exceptional aircraft, but to mass-produce it in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy. By war's end, North American aviation had built 15,486 Mustangs, a production achievement that the resource-strapped German aviation industry could never hope to match. It also showcased the power of technological adaptation and international cooperation. The Mustang's transformation from a mediocre low-altitude fighter to the definitive high-altitude escort was made possible by the integration of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with an American airframe, a partnership that created something greater than either nation could have achieved alone. For German pilots who had entered the war confident in their superior training, tactics, and technology, the Mustang's arrival over Berlin forced a harsh reassessment. As one Luftwaffe veteran put it after the war, "We had believed our own propaganda about American technical inferiority. The Mustang proved how catastrophically wrong we were." The final word perhaps belongs to Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 356th Fighter Group. The day we flew to Berlin was the day the Luftwaffe died. They had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that we couldn't reach that far. When that assumption collapsed, so did their ability to defend German airspace. The Mustang didn't just extend our range, it broke their spirit. The P-51 Mustang remains the iconic fighter of World War II's European theater, the aircraft that silenced German laughter and secured Allied air supremacy. When Luftwaffe pilots looked up on that March morning in 1944 and saw Mustangs flying over Berlin, they witnessed not just a tactical surprise, but the undeniable mathematics of defeat.